Hi, everyone. So this week, the featured philosopher is Sir William David Ross. I wanted to highlight some of his ideas for a few reasons, and that is he's a little bit more modern than some of the other philosophers that we've talked about. He's not quite, back in the ancient times, and we've been focusing a lot on those philosophers. And then also because I thought he brings us back into the ancient times with some of his ideas, and he's got some really interesting points that I think apply to what we're experiencing in our lives right now. So I just wanted to highlight his philosophy and key points and how they might apply to your own life. So William David Ross, or William David Ross, he was born in 1877 and he died in 1971. He was a British philosopher, a college administrator, a World War I veteran, a civil servant, and a humanities scholar. And he's most known for his important contribution to moral philosophy and also the study of classical literature. So just a few key points that I'll talk about today is that his work in ethics is developed in what's called pluralistic deontology. And this is articulated in his book, The Right and the Good, which was published in 1930. So he proposed that moral duties are not absolute and derived from a single principle like utilitarianism or Kantian ethics, but instead they arise from multiple, what he calls prima facie duties. And so here are some of the key things that we can learn about that and then how they apply to our lives. So this idea of moral pluralism and the complexity of duty, Ross argued that there are multiple moral duties that guide our behavior, and they often conflict with one another. So as we've been having our discussions, you might have noticed that maybe your ideas aren't necessarily logically consistent. And that could be one of the reasons, and that we're very complex human beings. Our morality is very complex. And so the duties that Ross likes to, or that he highlighted, were fidelity, keeping promises, reparation, rectifying wrongs, gratitude, returning favors, justice, distributing benefits based on merit, beneficence, improving others' conditions, self-improvement, bettering of oneself, and non-malfeasance, or avoiding harm to others. So some of these we've already talked about. Beneficence and non-malfeasance you're familiar with. And you can see that some of these ideas also were found in Aristotle, in Kant, and can be found in various world religions also. So the lesson here is that moral decision-making is complex. It really can't be reduced to a single rule or principle. You've probably noticed that already. But instead that we need to weigh conflicting duties and make balanced judgments in specific situations. So this would encourage us to be flexible and attentive to the context of our ethical reasoning. So another key idea of Ross's is this prima facie duties. And this is a concept where these duties are binding unless they conflict with a stronger duty in any particular reason. So for instance, honesty is a prima facie duty, but it could be overridden if telling the truth would cause unjust harm. So you remember when we talked about Kant and his ideas on truth-telling, he thought that you should tell the truth at all times, and there was some conflict there as to whether or not we would still tell the truth, even if it would harm somebody else. And Ross is saying that that we should override this duty that we have to be honest in the face of harm. So the lesson here, what we can, practice and take home for ourselves is that we can recognize certain moral obligations may seem important, but they're not absolute, right? We've been having a conflict between the universal and the relative, things that are absolute and apply to everybody versus things that are individualistic and apply to cultures or people, individuals, and so forth. And that's kind of one of those big arguments in philosophy. And so Ross is really telling us that These moral obligations are not absolute, that ethical decisions require discernment, prioritization, right? We have to prioritize, and we have to take into account each situation's nuances. Another key idea that Ross talks about is moral intuitionism. So Ross was a moral intuitionist. What does this mean? This means that he believed that we can discern moral truths through our intuitive understanding of right and wrong. Some philosophers are much more logical. They wouldn't like this idea at all. They would completely object to this idea of intuitionism because it places decision-making into the role of each individual instead of kind of that absolute that we're going for. So we might not have a scientific formula for ethical decisions. We can develop and trust our moral intuition, particularly with experience. So probably in your academic life, the things like critical thinking have been emphasized, logic has been emphasized, and emotions have been seen as negative. And here Ross is telling us that we need to develop our sense of intuition, that we can trust that sense of intuition, particularly with experience. And you probably have noticed that you use your intuition all the time, right? Even if it conflicts with something that you've thought critically about or had a logical understanding of. So his idea here then is that ethical understanding is often innate, right, within us. It's not necessarily learned, but we're already born with it. But we can cultivate that through reflection and experience. And this kind of goes back to what Plato says about how we have these innate qualities that we can bring out through reasoning, right? And so we don't necessarily have to experience something to know it, to know that it is the truth. But Ross is sort of combining this idea of cultivating both reflection and experience and bringing those pieces together. So he says that trusting our intuition when balanced with reason can guide us during morally ambiguous situations. The fourth thing that I'll mention about Ross is balancing outcomes and rules. He's really into balance, and some of you might like that. A lot of you have talked about balance and the importance of balance in your lives. So Ross's ethics represent this kind of middle ground between strict rule-based deontology or Kantian ethics and consequentialism, which you saw was more flexible. So while Ross emphasized duties, he also acknowledges the importance of considering consequences when resolving moral dilemmas. So you can see he's piecing together both utilitarianism and deontological ideas. So what does this mean for us? This means that both the rules and the outcomes matter. So you've probably noticed in thinking about all of these ethical dilemmas that we've discussed and different ideas we've come across, that it's sort of been like this either or situation, but that you're not really an either or kind of person, and that kind of, as I mentioned at the beginning of class, we're really blending all these various ethical pieces together. And so here Ross is telling us that that's okay. We shouldn't rigidly follow rules without considering the consequences, nor should they focus exclusively on consequences without regard for duties. So then the last thing that I'll mention here is moral growth and imperfection. So Ross's framework acknowledges that moral decision-making can be challenging, as I said, and that individuals may sometimes fail to perfectly balance their duties, right? We do this all the time. But he emphasized the importance of striving for improvement, right? So if you think back to like Aristotle, and he does have some grounding in Aristotle and takes his ideas from there, and Plato, right, and this striving towards excellence, and even ideas from Confucius, and the idea of cultivating ourselves and growing personally and developing all these traits within our personality that are strong and positive. Ross really, emphasizing this is also emphasizing the importance for striving to improve ourselves, right? And that's a daily practice. So the lesson really, or the takeaway here, is that our ethical journey is ongoing. Mistakes are inevitable, but moral progress comes from continuously refining our understanding of duties and striving to make better decisions. So what this means is that, like, we don't just stop, right? Oh, these are our ethics, and we stop and we just utilize them. It's an ongoing process, a journey through our lives. And you've probably noticed that your beliefs and the way you handle situations is very different now than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, depending on your age, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, right? As we progress through life, we have new experiences, we encounter new perspectives, and Ross is allowing us to continue on our journey and incorporate these things into our lives to sort of make us the best people that we can be. So kind of to sum this up then, Ross's ethical framework teaches the importance of balancing competing duties, trusting your moral intuitions, approaching ethical dilemmas with flexibility and attentiveness to the particulars of each situation, and encouraging us to reflect deeply on our obligations and remain open to moral growth. So I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about Sir William David Ross, and that you'll find some of these things play a part in your lives, and that you can implement some of his ideas in a way that makes sense to you. Take what you need, right? Discard what doesn't fit for you. And I hope you have a great week.